From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, pro sports. Should the government intervene?
I'm Peter Hackus. More than 50 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that baseball was more of a sport than a business. It's a national pastime, said the court, not a commercial enterprise. Well, that ruling made baseball unique. It led to such things as the reserve clause, which made baseball players the exclusive property of one team. It led to a law passed much later by Congress, which said network broadcasting rights to professional sporting events are exempt from antitrust regulations. Recently, several courts have declared the reserve clause inoperative, but the multi-million-dollar broadcast rights monopoly continues. What does all the recent maneuvering mean to professional football and baseball? What effect does it have on other professional sports, such as basketball and hockey? Should team franchises be allowed to move whenever the going gets tough? Should players be encouraged to sell themselves to the highest bidder? Will draft of college players continue, and does that build competitive balance among the teams? Finally, whose interests are most at stake in all of this? The owners, the players, the communities which invest vast sums of money in arenas, or the sports fans? Who, in the end, pays for it all? Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Today, 4 panelists will discuss the topic, pro sports. Should the government intervene? Appearing on our panel are Republican Congressman Jack Kemp of New York, now in his 4th term in Congress. Representative Kemp spent 13 years as a professional football player. As a quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, he was voted the American Football League's most valuable player in 1965. Mr. Kemp was a co-founder and the first president of the AFL Players Association. Lee MacPhail, president of baseball's American League since 1974. Mr. MacPhail has spent 34 years in professional baseball as a business manager, general manager, as the top executive of the Baltimore Orioles and of the New York Yankees, and then as a top league executive. Ed Garvey, an attorney who for the last 6 years has been executive director of the National Football League Players Association. Mr. Garvey represented the NFL players during their 1970 negotiations with the club owners. He later guided them through the players' strike and the lockout, and the negotiations for a second contract in 1977. Roger Noll, a professor of economics at the California Institute of Technology, currently on leave, teaching at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. Professor Noll has been a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's considered an expert in the field of government regulations as they apply to sports, and also an expert in the economics of professional sports. Moderating the panel today is John Charles Daly. Mr. Daly is a veteran news analyst and correspondent for both CBS and ABC. He also served as Vice President of ABC. For 3 years, he was the head of the Voice of America. Now, here's Mr. Daly.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is titled, Pro Sports, Should the Government Intervene? Well, the fact, of course, is that the government has intervened for a long time. 2 of our 3 co-equal branches of government, the judicial and the legislative, have affected the character of professional sports substantially. Mr. Justice Wendell Holmes ruled in Federal Baseball versus National League back in 1922 that the business of giving exhibitions of baseball was not within interstate commerce for the purposes of the federal antitrust laws. Behind this bulwark, baseball waged continuous battle for years to sustain its reserve clause defining the character and the restrictions of service for professional baseball players. The year 1976, under terms of a contract between owners and the Players Association, new rules opened a free agent status to a player after 5 or 6 years' service in the majors. In football, a former Washington Redskin, James McCoy Yazoo Smith, filed an antitrust suit charging the college draft constituted a per se violation under antitrust law, and an earlier recent case, Mackey versus National Football League, involved an antitrust challenge to the NFL's so-called Rozelle Rule, which established criteria under which a football player might become a free agent. It can be said that baseball and basketball's management and players' associations have, in broad terms, essentially made their peace, and 1977 found agreement in principle by management and players in football. Finally, a House Select Committee on Professional Sports in 1976 investigated energetically, quote, the apparent instability prevailing in the sports industry's 4 major professional team sports, baseball, basketball, football, and hockey, and recommended that a successor oversight committee be established with full authority to conduct inquiries into the need for legislation with respect to all professional sports. That's it in a nutshell. Our question is, pro sports, should the government intervene? And I'll add further. Now, Congressman Kemp, as an all-AFL quarterback and 1965 AFL Player of the Year, as co-founder and former president of the AFL Players Association, and beginning after, what, your 7th year in the Congress, yes, in the House of Representatives, do you think a further House inquiry into legislation with respect to professional sports is wise or necessary?
Well, I have been appointed to that House committee, and I generally favor having the Congress look at the structure of professional sports from the standpoint of pursuing legislation that would place all sports relatively equal under the antitrust laws. I think that all the sports should not be treated separately. They should come under antitrust with certain partial exemptions for those aspects of the business that provide the competitive strength on the football field or the baseball diamond that make the game attractive to the consumer and help provide the type of revenues that make it a highly paid and well-supported business. But generally speaking, I would favor a rather limited approach, but generally speaking, a hands-off approach by government, relying upon the self-regulating mechanisms of the business with the strong collective bargaining environment that has been built up in sports in the last 10 years.
All right, Mr. Garvey, pardon me, as General Counsel first of the National Football League Players Association and Executive Director, which you have been since 1971, I believe, you've been in the front line in the management-players conflicts these past years. Do you see a future of self-regulation or government intervention in professional sport?
Well, government first intervened by giving tremendous powers to the owners through the exemption of the antitrust laws for the owners to pool their television rights. But then the Congress intervened again and allowed the merger of the American Football League and the National Football League without writing any protection into those laws for the fans or for the players. And so government really has intervened, and government has intervened in a way that has made it very difficult for that self-regulation, because you have relatively weak player unions against, very strong owner organizations where they can split expenses and work their will pretty much the way they want to. So government has intervened, and it's intervened only on one side, and that is to build up power on the side of management. So self-regulation is going to require stronger efforts by the players and possibly joint selection of a commissioner and some other efforts along those lines.
All right, Mr. MacPhail, 34 years as variously business manager, general manager, team executive, and your present position as president of the American League in baseball, giving you a very broad perspective. What do you think of the present situation in baseball, specifically vis-a-vis the government?
Well, John, we've had problems in all sports, in baseball just as in the others. I think we've made progress in solving those problems. We've reached an agreement with our Players Association, which I think is a very fine and fair one for both sides, in which the need for the reserve system was recognized by both sides, and together we constructed a reserve system that I think both sides can live under. As far as government supervision of professional sports, I feel our country is based primarily on a laissez-faire type society with supervision and regulation where that is necessary and where it's been shown that it's necessary. But I think professional sports have handled themselves responsibly, and although we welcome something like the Congressional Committee, basically we don't think that there should be government regulation per se.
Professor Noll, your study, Government and the Sports Business, which you edited as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, is an exhaustive examination of the economics of organized sports. Do you see a future that is sound economically worked out within the sports industry?
Yes, I think the economics of professional sports are looking good, but not quite so great as in the past. Obviously, the golden days of being an owner are long since gone. 2 of the 5 special arrangements enjoyed by professional sports have gone or are going by the wayside. One is the control of the player market by allocating players among teams and giving teams monopoly rights to bargain with that pool of players assigned to it. The stronger player unions have pretty much undone that, both through the courts and through collective bargaining. And obviously the players are going to claim an increasing share of the revenue of professional sports as the unions get more and therefore get more strength to get even more. Secondly, the tax laws are rapidly eroding the use of professional sports as a tax shelter. Congress enacted a weak law that cut substantially the tax shelter. Currently, the Internal Revenue Service is fighting in the courts to reduce the tax shelter aspect of professional sports even more than the maximum made possible in the laws. But there still exist 3 special arrangements that professional sports enjoys that are going to continue to make it a profitable enterprise for both owners and players, more so than it would be if it were a competitive business. One is the arrangements with regards to stadiums, that stadiums now are more numerous than the number of teams in most sports. Cities have to get into competitive bidding arrangements, making fools of themselves often by offering incredible rental deals to get a team to stay in the city or to move from another city. Secondly, the broadcasting arena, as Mr. Garvey mentioned, is one in which the leagues have legal monopoly to bargain as leagues rather than as consortiums of teams, several consortiums of teams, or as even individual teams, to sell broadcasting rights to ball games in all sports. And again, this substantially increases the revenue for all teams at the expense, of course, of networks, who I don't feel terribly sorry for, but nevertheless it cuts down the amount of broadcasting that fans have access to. Third, we still have the territorial rights, which is perhaps the most egregious wrong of all in the monopolistic practices in professional sports. The nation's capital can sit here for 6 or 7 years without a baseball team. The number of franchises can be controlled by owners and doled out just like a monopolist deals out anything else he can monopolize. Contrived scarcity. Fewer cities that have teams than can support them. Many teams could support more teams, but they only have a limited number. This, of course, leads to the kind of phenomena that we have all observed in the recent years. As sports have become more popular, particularly football, the response of the monopolist is predictable. The ticket prices go up and up and up, and unlike in a competitive industry, higher ticket prices don't induce new firms in to compete. It just means the monopolists, who now include the players, since they can share in the take with the union, just the players and the owners share in higher monopoly revenues. So it all looks to me like the financing looks good, but part of that goodness arises from the fact that the fan is getting ripped off.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. You go ahead, Mr.
I would like
MacPhail,
to answer very quickly. I don't think the fan is being ripped off. The average price of tickets in the American League last year, the per capita, was $3.08. I don't see how you can, there's no entertainment anywhere in the country that's more reasonable than that. And you can still sit in the bleachers for $1, or general admission for $1 or $1.50. Professional clubs haven't been making that kind of money. There's no gouging of the public. I don't think in any sport has the record shown that ownership has made unfair and unconscionable profits.
If I could comment on that.
Just a second, he'd asked if he might be. So
Well, I was just going to say that I was a part for 13 years of that so-called monopoly, and the American League, from which I came, started as a competitive business to the National Football League, and I would remind Mr. Noll, who takes a very academic but a rather unrealistic view of professional sports in America today, that in 1957, however you look at it, there were only 12 teams, there were 32 men on a squad, there were no taxi squads, salaries in professional football, I can't tell you what they are, and Mr. Garvey could probably give you some type of an average, but I can tell you that Bobby Lane in 1957, when I started with Detroit Lions or was drafted by Detroit, was making somewhere around $16,000 or $17,000. He was the premier quarterback in professional football. As I say, there were 32 men on a squad, 12 teams in the league. The American League started. Regardless of what people think about the merger, I happen to think that today it's pretty obvious in the history of a relatively short period of time, there are 28 teams. There are player limits of, 42 or 40 with 5 or 10 on taxi squads. The salaries have increased substantially. There is more professional sports on television. There are more people watching sports. There are more young people getting access to, I think, a very healthy influence of competitive athletics on television than ever before. And by any reasonable standard, it seems to me that these are the things that the consumer, individual Americans, the fans, are interested in. Getting a good product, getting it on television if they can't get it at the game, and at a price that they can afford. The ticket prices are subject to a lot more than just the so-called monopolistic prices or monopolistic practices that Mr. Noll talks about. But I would say on record, generally, overall, that the people of America are seeing more sports. The athletes are doing better in professional sports. The market has opened up to where far more young men, and hopefully someday there'd be professional sports for women as there is in tennis, more sports. It seems to me that on the record it has done a lot better than Mr. Noll would give credit to it.
Mr. Garvey?
Well, I hate to steal Roger's thunder because I know he's ready to jump in, but I think both of you make the point I was going to make, and that is you focus on the athlete. You say, well, the athlete was only making $16,000 then, he's making 40 now, or 35, or whatever it is. And the Congress tends to do the same thing. They say, well, if we're going to regulate, let's take a look at the player. The simple fact is we have never known what the owners make. We have never been able to look into the records of the owners of baseball or football to see really what that profit picture is. And the test is not what Bobby Lane was making back in 1956. The test is whether he was getting his proper share of the revenues then or whether the athlete is today. And one of the problems as we view it is every time people talk about regulation, they talk about regulating the athlete, but they never talk about regulating the owner. And if Congress or some other branch of the government is going to get into this kind of a question, it seems to me that what they should be looking at is how much money is being made, whether stadium rental is fair to the taxpayer, whether a team should be allowed to move at will just by announcing that it's losing money and things of that nature, rather than to worry about whether there are more players today making more than Bobby Lane made in 1956.
President Noll?
I would just like to add that I think Congressman Kemp, unbeknowingly maybe, gave an excellent speech in favor of competitive free enterprise. He talked about how the American Football League changed things. It sure did. It more than doubled the number of jobs available to professional football players. It substantially increased the availability of football to people who want to attend games in person, to people who want to watch it on television. In fact, one of the things that did happen was an expansion of fourfold the number of televised football games as a consequence of this competition between the two leagues. Competition meant they competed for cities. They fought to get into Atlanta. They fought to get into other cities. They fought to hire players. Player salaries went up. The period that in fact gave Congressman Kemp the opportunity to prove to all of us that he is a first-class, all-star quarterback. He never got the opportunity to play professional football until there was competition. And look how good he was. Now that's exactly what you get when there's competition. More for the fans, more for the players, a more exciting enterprise. The merger came along and ended that competition. And in terms of professional baseball, which has never had that competition, we still find this strange mystical dance that the politicians and the owners and the players engage in debating about a baseball team for Washington, D.C., or in debating who's going to play where in which stadium and why. There are fans out there in places like Washington, D.C., and in other places around the country who would like to have the opportunity to prove that their city can support the game. But they don't get that opportunity because the number of franchises is governed on the basis of the financial best interests of the owners. It's not on the basis of anything else. And that's what I regard as the next big, major public policy issue. What kind of arrangements can be made that protect the existing owners against financial catastrophe, owing teams folding in the middle of the season and having bad financial obligations, protect the integrity of the sport, and still allow the number of teams to be governed by the interest of fans in the sport. And that's what I would like to see happen in all the sports, and I don't see anybody lobbying very hard for it because the amalgamated fans of America has yet to be formed and collectively bargain or lobby Congress for relief to this particular monopolistic practice.
Mr. MacPhail.
You said that our only reply addressed itself to the athletes and what was happening to the athletes. My reply concentrated upon the price of tickets and the profits of ownership. And I would like to hear you say that either one of those were out of line.
You know, if I could, I'm not saying that profits are out of line in baseball or they're out of line in football or hockey. What I'm saying is we don't know whether they are. I don't think the Congress knows, because every time there's been an effort to try and get that information, the owners have said, oh no, this is free enterprise, we don't have to show you this. So when the ABA and the NBA wanted to merge, Senator Ervin said, well, please bring your books and records up here, including your personal income tax statements, to see whether you're really losing money. And they said, well, no, that's not what we had in mind. And so, you know, if you talk about the athlete, because they have a press conference and say so-and-so is making $100,000, the fan says, gee, he's overpriced and pampered and we shouldn't feel sorry for him. What they don't know is whether the Washington Redskins are really making $500,000 or, as they say, losing $500,000. They don't know what the average profit is, and therefore they don't know whether the fan really is getting a fair shake, and that was my point.
Ed, I respect what you say, but I'll tell you what, there wouldn't have been any argument in pro sports a number of years ago, especially in pro football, about profits, because it wasn't that profitable a business, indeed, if it was profit-making at all. The game did not have the television exposure. It did not have the attraction of the fans to the extent that it does today. And I only use the 57 experience to 1977 experience to put in comparison how far professional sports, especially football, have come. Now, Mr. Noll says that he can't buy a professional baseball franchise, nor can I. I can't buy a McDonald's franchise. I'd love to have one. I can think of some places that we might retire with a franchise if we could get one. But that doesn't necessarily suggest that the World Football League, the American Football League, the Canadian football, or that some entrepreneur in the near future, if there is a market for his product or for that league, could not start up. The monopoly that you suggest exists today is I would grant you, is a natural monopoly, which is a big difference than a government instituted or government promoted or agreed upon monopoly. And the fact that the American League did get started, the fact that the World Football League got started, then failed, I think makes the point that I'm trying to make, that some of the that professional sports are not to be treated exactly like a business. It is a franchise operation. That the Buffalo Bills, when they play the New York Jets, are not out to wipe each other off the field, wipe each other out financially. They're out to beat each other on that football field. There is not economic competition. They share the television revenue, they share the gate, they share radio, they share the talent, so that they can have as competitive a product on the football field as is possible. That is the only way that Buffalo, I think, that's the only way that Green Bay, Wisconsin, that's the only way that smaller cities with smaller markets can possibly compete with a market such as New York, Los Angeles, or other cities such as that. And I would only go back to the time when we were all very young and we were playing sports out in the street, and whether it was baseball or football or any other sport, we stopped before the game started. We had captains who each chose players in a reciprocal fashion so that you could get a good game. And a good game was predicated upon each team having relatively the same talent. And it seems to me that that enhances the competitive product that you're as anxious to sell as I am, Ed, and ultimately enhances the salary and profits of the players and the owners.
I think it'd be useful to the understanding of our audience and perhaps to our discussion if one of you would volunteer to state what the actual situation now is in baseball and football. Would you take the baseball?
I can state it in baseball. Our previous reserve clause was that each contract had a reserve clause in it, so the player was therefore bound to play each succeeding year. That was struck down through a grievance procedure brought by the Players Association in the case of Andy Messersmith, which in effect just wiped out the reserve system as we know it in baseball, or as we had known it. Then together with the Players Association and the Player Relations Committee of the owners, we bargained to set up a new reserve system. The Players Association readily saw the need for a reserve system. In fact, Congress has recognized that need. The courts have recognized that need, particularly in baseball, where we have a problem of player development and bringing young players along in a minor league structure to support. But to answer your question, we have negotiated a reserve system which says that because the club spends a lot of money on player development, invests in him when he gets out of school, brings him up through the minor league system, they are entitled to have 6 years service from that player. At the end of that time, he can elect to be a free agent if he desires to do so. At the end of 5 years, he can ask to be traded, that his contract be traded, and in that event, he can void a certain number of teams that can get him. Then, if a player becomes a free agent, we have a rather complicated reentry system, which is designed to maintain the competitive balance and make the points that Mr. Kemp made, that to protect a smaller franchise and enable them to compete against a stronger.
What about football?
Since 1963 in football, we've had something called the Rozelle Rule, which is the naming of compensation for a player once he plays out his contract. In the old days, it was called the option clause. Hopefully those are the old days. And when he would try to sign with another team, the team that he was signing with had to compensate his former team with a player of like quality. If they could not agree, then the commissioner would name compensation for that player. The court in the Mackey case ruled that there was virtually no difference between that and the baseball reserve clause because the team signing the player, or wishing to sign the player, feared this unknown compensation and therefore would not sign the player. So basically there was little difference. Both sports tried to justify their reserve system on this so-called competitive balance. The fact is that I think a lot of sports announcers say on any given Sunday in professional football that means that one team can beat another. Well, that's not exactly my idea of competitive balance, nor is the idea of New Orleans never having a 500 season exactly competitive balance. We think essentially the reserve system did not bring about that balance. It in fact locked in certain teams who were winning and locked in certain teams that were losing. So it was a very slow process. But in essence, there was no difference among the four sports. I think all of us are now moving toward a different system in large measure because the courts have said there has to be an element of fairness. You can't just say that the owners are going to sit down and say that we need this control of players in order to bring about balance when they won't control coaches or general managers or even the profit sharing or the gate sharing in other sports. We'll just control the players. And I think that's kind of, quote, interference, unquote, has been very helpful to change the system in all sports.
You want to add anything to that?
I have no quarrel with his statement. I think it ought to be fair. It ought to be fair to the players. It ought to be fair to the owners. It ought to be fair to the sport, and also fair to the fans. And I happen to believe that if the Congress had tried to interject itself at the point at which Mr. Garvey was negotiating with the owners of professional football, and I think that, frankly, you'd have ended up with Congress making a public utility out of pro sports, and I don't think that would serve the interests of the fans, the players, or the owners, and that it's something I feel so strongly about that I think so many people think subjectively about it. They don't realize what would happen if the Congress took that approach.
Professor Noll?
Yes, one of the central issues in the debate about the extent to which restrictive practices in sports are necessary centers around the issue of competitive balance. We've heard it mentioned by several people here. And I think it's just clear, we ought to get clear on the record that if one does a systematic analysis of the competitive balance of leagues as measured by the mixing phenomena in league standings, as measured by the dispersion in won-loss records between the best and the worst teams, as measured by almost any kind of statistical measure of balance you want to adopt, there's absolutely zero evidence that competitive balance is affected by the mechanism for dealing with players. In professional football, for example, I once went through a list of who had made the playoffs in professional football in the last 7 years. And the number of teams is just the same, year after year after year. Ed pointed out in New Orleans, but there's a list of on the order of 10 teams in professional football which haven't made a playoff in 10 years. Now, if it's true that the restrictive system in the player market causes competitive balance, it is indeed a slow-working process. And one wonders if all the restrictions on an individual's right to decide where he wants to live is in fact worth it if it takes more than a decade for the mixing phenomena in league finishes to take place.
Well, in practice, it doesn't take a decade, and there's been many instances in which teams have been able to work their way up in the league standings through use of the draft. I'm not suggesting, and I don't want to be put in a position of suggesting that the draft is the only way a team can, move up in the standings. Talent, coaching, fan support, lack of good ownership or good ownership. There are many intangibles and many tangible aspects of professional sports competition. But I think there is some evidence, and I would only point, at least in professional football, with which I'm familiar, that prior to the draft, there was domination of professional football by 2 or 3 teams. When the draft was first implemented and instituted by Bert Bell back in 1940-something, I think from that time on, there is evidence that it brought about a more competitive climate. Now, my only point is that some of the statements that have been made have been made in the abstract. I don't suggest they've been made in the abstract by Ed Garvey because he is there at the front lines, and I think he's done an admirable job of representing the interests of the players. But Mr. Noll's remarks about, for instance, just take television. On one instance, one hand, he is very much interested in bringing about more television, more televising of games to the fans. On the other hand, he opposes the pooling of the television rights of, say, professional football, which gave professional football and the fans the right not only to give professional football the right to television rights through pooling, but also gave the fans the right to see the home game. Up until the time of the pooling, there was no away game telecast into every home team. There is more television now coming back into those NFL franchise cities because of that pooling. And if it hadn't have been for that pooling, there would not have been an American Football League. So those were necessary ingredients that made the game popular and made it exposed to ever more fans throughout the
Congressman, the year
United
before
States.
the Sports Broadcasting Act was passed, there were 3 separate organizations of National Football League teams, 3 separate consortia that each had nationwide television games on Sundays. There were 3 competitive NFL broadcasts plus the AFL broadcast.
And Roger, they were on 2 networks. They were on 2
No,
networks.
they were on 4 because there was all three networks plus a 4th network of independents.
Well, interestingly enough, the American Football League, when it started, sued the National Football League for operating on 2 networks.
Right.
And then when the National Football League dropped off the 2 network and dropped onto 1 by pooling its TV rights, they were then sued by the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department. So they were on opposite sides of antitrust legislation within 2 years.
But the problem, if you look at the World Football League, was that the Justice Department did nothing, and the National Football League had ABC, NBC, and CBS tied up because of their pooling arrangements and their probable willingness to take less from ABC than they could get from any one network or less total. And the World Football League was faced with a situation where it could not really break into the market. So that decision by the Congress to allow that sort of pooling and inaction by the Justice Department meant that, in fact, the World Football League was not going to make it as a viable entity. So, I think that when these actions are taken, at least one has a responsibility to look at what the aftermath is. And I think it did help to bring about the demise of the World Football League, along with some bad management.
Mr. MacPhail?
I just wanted to note that it's hard to believe that anyone would think that there wasn't enough professional football on television today.
Well, let's go to the...
There's too much baseball.
Let's go back to the fan. I'm very happy that collective bargaining at arm's length has improved the players and their income prospects and pensions and all that sort of thing. And I'm saddened that football has felt the sting and the lash of inflation, as we all have. But it has brought the day when football ticket prices are getting very high. And to what degree do we exclude the fans simply because the economics are so demanding as to rather make this a spectator sport, at least in person, which can be seen only by an elite group? Who wants to start?
I'll start, and I know Professor Noll won't agree with what I have to say because I know he has a different view on this subject. But I honestly believe that any city that has a proper market area that can support baseball and has a proper facility and has ownership there that has the necessary capital and has the confidence of the locale, I think in time, any city that's in that situation will get a Major League Baseball club, and I would dare say the same was probably true of the other sports. We have had a problem in Washington that we're trying to work out, but Washington didn't meet all those qualifications at the time it lost its club.
What about the economics of high-priced tickets for football?
Well, before I talk about the economics of high-priced tickets for football, I'd like to respond to Mr. MacPhail. I don't think I disagree with him as much as he might think. I suspect that it's true that in time, if somebody's willing to lay out $12, $15 million, they can get a team in almost every league. But part of the problem, it seems to me, is in fact the whole idea that it has to be negotiated out to the mutual benefit and satisfaction of the existing ownership. That, as you say, that they have to in fact convince the existing owners that it's worthwhile. I don't see why we should feel that any industry, the firms in it, should be guaranteed that they won't fail. And Mr. MacPhail is absolutely right, incidentally. The American League deserves plaudits for being quite atypical, really, in what's happening to ticket prices. And in baseball in general, the spread of ticket prices between the most expensive and the least expensive teams is quite narrow compared to most sports. It's only about a factor of 2 between the cheapest and most expensive teams. If you go into professional basketball, for example, a single game in Madison Square Garden that's sold out for the Knicks, which they sell out several, will get almost as much revenue as an entire season for some of the other teams. There's enormous spread in ticket prices in most of the other sports. And there's lots of what economists call excess demand, that is to say long waiting lists at existing prices to get season tickets to the Washington Redskins, for example. Well, what that betokens is the fact that the prices are very high, yes, but lots of people are willing to pay them. In fact, so many are willing to pay them that in the very best markets there's room for more teams.
As usual, I'd like to defend NFL management and suggest that one of the difficult problems that football has is you have a very short season. So that you can't really compare football and baseball or basketball, where in basketball they play 86 games or something, in baseball they play 412, and in football you only have 10 home games really to make the money, and so the ticket prices are naturally going to be higher. You have a higher squad size in football than you do in any of the other sports, so that again raises the cost. I do want to also suggest that an innovation really of the National Football League of sharing gate receipts and sharing television revenues equally probably has more to do with bringing about balance within the National Football League than any reserve system, Rozelle rule, waiver system, trading, or anything else. And I think that if basketball and the other sports would share revenues more equally, as football has, and in fact maybe even move to a 50-50 split, I think you'd eliminate a lot of the problems for fans in places with small stadiums, and you'd make it easier all the way around to have more balance.
Let me make a point, John, and I agree with what Ed Garvey said. Beyond that, in talking to the point that Roger Noll said earlier, that if Congress or the political process were to really look objectively at professional sports, it would ultimately come to the fairest conclusion, which is that they would establish a climate in which there would be total competition for leagues, for teams, that the players would have a total free market, and that if a franchise failed and threatened to cause some type of problems with the league, that financial disaster would have to be precluded or prevented by or through the political process. Now, as long as a fan can buy a ticket or abstain from buying a ticket, he or she is protected by the marketplace. They have the freedom of choice. But as soon as that fan becomes a tax-paying fan, in terms of trying to subsidize a franchise that may be losing, or to subsidize a franchise that might want to move and should be subject to the market that has been praised in some areas here before, it seems to me that is what makes the difference. And you've got to consider the alternative. And as bad as it is to see the Jets maybe threaten to move out of Shea Stadium, or to watch the Dodgers move from New York to Los Angeles, as bad as that is, I agree with Sam Ervin, I agree with Senator Hart, who both looked at this in I think, a fairly objective way and not from any ideological standpoint, and came to the conclusion that the market was a better determiner for the franchise operation than was the political process.
That's obviously true. I agree with you completely. The reason we care...
I thought I heard you say that
no,
the franchise
no, you
should be protected from...
No, I said that's what's happening, in fact, is that the way the current mechanism works is that pretty much you can't get into the league unless you can guarantee you won't fail. And I agree with you completely. There's absolutely nothing wrong...
That's probably true of many franchises, though. Would you agree?
That's fine. And the reason we care about teams moving is because we can't replace them. That's why people in New York care about the Jets going over to New Jersey, because they can't replace them.
I care about teams moving too. The point that I'm trying to make is, though, that the business entity in professional sports is not the individual franchise. The real business entity, to a large degree, has to be the league. The league rises and falls with the competitive balance, with the financial success, as Ed Garvey mentioned, of every franchise operator in the league. And I'm just suggesting that the league over the years has prospered as it has had that competition, as it has shared not only the resources that come to the clubs via the process of the consumption of that product, but also because they've been able to share talent and keep that game as attractive on the field as possible.
I'd like to ask Professor Noll a question, if I may. Professor, if you had been a member of the American League and you were sitting there with a vote on what happened, and you had voted to permit a team in Seattle, Washington, when the ownership there wasn't properly financed, probably wasn't the proper ownership to represent Seattle in professional baseball, when the facility wasn't proper for Major League Baseball, and if you had voted yes, and then you had seen that club go into bankruptcy and had the federal bankruptcy court order it sold to Milwaukee, and then have your league and you as a member sued by the area there for deserting Seattle, if all that had happened to you, and then you came to another situation which was fairly similar, don't you think you'd be inclined to vote against giving ownership to someone who wasn't? I know you yourself have pointed out in your book that one of the problems that baseball has, and when you question their financial statements, is the heavy interest expense. That is one of the toughest problems we have for clubs operating if the club is not properly financed and they're carrying a large interest expense. And if you see a club start and you know that they're not properly financed, you know they're going to have a large interest expense, and you know that they're not going to be able to break even, do you think that's wrong then for the league to?
No, not in the least. No, in fact, if I were an owner, I perhaps would be even worse than many of the existing owners. I wouldn't be. I wouldn't be a Phil Wrigley who is doing it for the good of his hometown. I would probably be a profit maximizer to the nth degree. I'm not trying to say that there's anything immoral or wrong or silly or stupid or anything. I think baseball owners and owners in sports in general are characterized by one phenomena. Almost to a man, they are good businessmen. They have established a track record in other enterprises besides baseball to prove it. and they behave in a sensible financial way. And one of the sensible financial ways is obviously if you want to collect $12 million for an expansion franchise, or going back to the Seattle days, $6 million, you want to make certain that the guy can pay it and that it works. And so if I were an owner, I'd behave just exactly like the owners behave. I would deal out the franchises very slowly at a very high price, only to gold-plated enterprises. But that isn't necessarily what's in the best interest of the sport taken as a whole, incorporating the interests of the fans, the players, and the owners all together. That an alternative to this is simply, instead of having the franchise be sold in this particular way, to have someone post a bond that would guarantee the complete financial operations of a team for a year and a half. If you want to get into the league, you have to put $4 million in a Chase Manhattan Bank, in a trust, which can only be used in case the team folds.
Or let the Players Association hold it.
I know. You go to the Riviera too much already, Garvey.
I believe I have the sense that the consensus really is that self-regulation would be the most desirable course rather than to have an increase in government intervention. Do I read that correctly in all of you?
You better ask each participant.
If you're looking at general safety, I think like other industries, we have to turn to OSHA, and unfortunately, we also have to turn to the Consumer Product Safety Commission for things like artificial turf. Now, some people say, well, that's interference, but the union itself is not strong enough, let's say, to say to Pittsburgh, you must rip up that artificial turf, which we know is causing more injuries, we know is hurting the careers of our people. And so we have to turn to the government in hopes that the government will do something to aid the union in its efforts. But otherwise, I think without the protection of the federal courts, the National Labor Relations Board, and so on, the union can be in deep trouble in professional sports because the owners tend to have enormous power, as we have seen in all sports. So we have to rely to a certain extent on that protective arm.
All right, if nobody else wants to add anything, I think it's time for us to open the question and answer session.
Questions involving the operation of professional sports cover a broad range, but basically they boil down to one issue. Is the professional sports business unique? Is there enough that's different about pro sports to permit that commercial enterprise to be treated differently from other businesses? What steps can or should be taken to protect the rights of the players? Are the players, on the other hand, helping to put teams out of business by continuing to demand higher and higher salaries, especially in smaller cities where numbers of fans are limited, so team income is limited? And once again, what does this all mean to the armchair quarterback, the sports fan who makes it all possible? Does government have a role to play here? And if so, what should that role be? Now, for some challenges to our panel, let's get the views of the experts in our audience.
May I have the first question, please? Right, sir.
Lee MacPhail, in his defense for franchise jumping, he cited the fact that what are baseball leagues to do when owners are underfinanced? And he cited the fact of the Seattle team, which the bankruptcy court ordered sold to Seattle. He cited the fact that the Washington team, that Bob Short was equally underfinanced. Yet the American League voted all of those people in. Why should the respective cities have to suffer for an American League blunder?
Well, Maury, I would agree with you that if they were indeed underfinanced, and I'm not saying the decision of the American League has been perfect and every time that it's had to cast its judgment, that they should not have been approved. Some of those go back some time. Mr. Short was already here owning the club at the time he moved it. And often the situation that we've been confronted with was where a club had to be sold, perhaps was in financial distress, and we had to make the best possible deal, the best possible arrangement we could, and perhaps we knew that the new owners were not financed as well as we would like them to, but there weren't any other owners around. Someone has to operate the club.
The question raised by Maury is an important one, especially as it relates to this discussion, because again, the heart of the matter is whether or not a sound economic decision was made in the interest of the business, either at the league level or at the franchise level, ought not to be the concern of the United States Congress. It doesn't seem to me that the antitrust laws ought to be used capriciously, waved over the heads of pro baseball, pro football, or anyone else in order to bludgeon them or leverage them into a city or out of a city or to change that decision. I think the market, and I agree with Sam Ervin, Senator Ervin, who said with all the problems that we have, they would be only exacerbated if the decision were moved from the market with all its faults to the Congress of the United States.
Garvey.
Let me say that I don't know anything about markets, but I do remember. I do remember when the Milwaukee Braves moved, and I grew up near there, and they moved to Atlanta, in my judgment, because they had contract money available from television that would give them short-term dollars, and they moved away from a city that really deserved baseball, had supported baseball. And it seems to me that if the Congress of the United States is simply going to say we will not really test the owners against any standard, including antitrust, we're going to allow this exemption to go on, then they are inviting that kind of abuse, which I think was clearly present in that case. And I think it just makes sense to remove that exemption and maybe set up some sort of standard for saying when a team can move, because it's a severe blow to a city when it loses a franchise.
Professor Noll.
Yes, just one further remark about relying on the market. As Congressman Kemp pointed out, that makes a great deal of sense. But relying on a market means more than letting a team move from one city to another because the market is better in the place where it's going. Relying on a market also means letting people go out of business if they face financial difficulties, having a system in which people are allowed to go out of business. It also means allowing people into the business when they perceive that a market is there. And all those features of the market are not present. Now, it is a long-standing principle of antitrust, and I hate to sound like a lawyer again, that fear of financial loss is not legally a viable antitrust defense. It won't be heard in a court as a defense. It is not part of the antitrust law.
Mr. MacPhail.
I'd just like to point out that if you do remove the ability that leagues have today to control the movement of franchises, whether it's through antitrust or government legislation or what, you're just increasing the chances for clubs to move, as you were saying, Ed, for something like the Milwaukee move to Atlanta should have been stopped by the National League. But if you take away their power to do that, then you will have no control, no stability, or no permanence.
Next question, please.
My name is Michael Keynes. I'm a professional economist, and I have written a dissertation on professional sport. I have a question for Mr. Garvey. Everybody has their own idea about what's a fair wage for players as well as other things. Now, I can understand why you would find desirable the recent court decisions which have reduced restrictions in the players' markets. One consequence of that has been that the teams have competed for those players, each team seeking to field a winning team and bidding up player prices in an effort to do so. But the net result for the league is that the number of wins and losses remains exactly the same, but wages are higher for the players. This raises costs to the team owners. Possibly some of these costs are passed on in terms of higher ticket prices. It also reduces the financial strength of the franchises. Possibly some go under as a consequence. Isn't this inimical to the fan interest? Aren't fans made worse off under the existing situation than they were under the previous situation when we had restrictions in the players' market?
Well, speaking on behalf of the fans, I would like to suggest that really a couple of consequences flow from the court decisions with the elimination of the restrictions. And the first is that it has really brought about collective bargaining for the first time, because the owners in the past, because of their enormous power, as opposed to the union, which was rather weak, could simply say, we're not going to change that system. And when the courts came along and said, yes, you are, because it's illegal, suddenly they said, well, gee, why don't we bargain about these restrictions and come up with something different? So that's been the first positive thing from our point of view. But secondly, we don't believe, and I'm going to play economist here, that ticket prices have anything to do with player salaries. Now, I say that, and I'm sure that heads will shake, but ultimately it would have something to do with ticket costs. But essentially, when the Washington Redskins set their ticket price level, they make a determination that that's what the market will bear as opposed to people staying home or doing something else. Obviously, if costs go up, the fans ultimately bear some of the cost, but you'll never know. You'll never know whether the Washington Redskins raised their ticket prices because of increased player costs or whether it was because of increased interest rates on a loan, or whether it was some other factor. And I'm not picking on the Redskins, it's any other team in the National Football League. And I think that's the real problem.
You want to speak to this point, Mr. Congressman?
Well, I was going to say that at the risk of disagreeing, the cost of production, whether it's the interest on a loan or some other cost, or the cost of labor, obviously is one of the factors, or are factors, in the cost of a ticket. I happen to think that a profit is a cost of production. It should be treated as such. You have to make a profit to keep the enterprise going, and it should be, like other costs, considered as such. The agreements that are being negotiated and been negotiated and have come into being in the last several years and the last several months are going to raise costs. They're going to raise salaries, and they're going to raise costs, and it's obvious, and it should be obvious. The negotiator, on behalf of the players, the player representatives, at Garvey, they are all subject to the forces of the market. And I think every union, every business has to sell its product at a price consistent with its ability to meet its cost of production, make a profit, and get the fans to come. And that can only be tested in the marketplace, it seems to me. And if the Redskins raise their price too high, ultimately it's going to cause a fall-off in fan interest, and it will hurt them at the worst possible place you can hurt them, in the pocketbook. And that's the fans' ultimate constitutional prerogative, and it's the greatest power that any consumer can ever have over a business, the right to buy or abstain from buying a particular product. And I think it should be protected as much as possible, given the realities of this less than perfect world.
Mr. MacPhail.
I would agree with Congressman Kemp on that, but I would also say that I know the figures that we read in the paper about athlete salaries these days are very alarming, and they're alarming to people that are in sports, because it's hard to see how professional sports can keep on with this kind of added expense. But I think whereas a few years ago too much advantage was given to ownership and negotiating contracts with players, and Mr. Garvey would agree with this. Now I think the pendulum has swung, and it's sort of the newness of the situation which drives clubs to do everything they can do to acquire some of the new free agents. And I think the pendulum will swing back. I think it will have to. Again, it's the marketplace that's going to determine this and make this, and I think there'll be a little more restraint and a little more economic reasonableness on the part of the clubs that will bring the player salaries back somewhere in a more logical position. I think the pendulum will eventually swing back a little bit.
This Public Policy Forum on Professional Sports has brought you the views of 4 experts in the field. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many views, in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.